Hello, and welcome to another PSP webinar presented to you today by the 3 CDSB Edmonton Reconditioning team. Today, our webinar is going to focus on ankle mobility and a few different issues surrounding that joint. Before we get started with the content of today's webinar, I'd like to introduce to you our reconditioning staff. My name is Erin Tresser, and I am the current reconditioning manager here in Edmonton. I have been in this role for the past 2 years. I am currently a CSEP clinical exercise physiologist and CSEP high performance specialist. Later on in this webinar, you'll hear from Kevin Malahai, who is our current physical exercise specialist. Kevin has been in his role for just over a year now. He currently holds his NSCA Certified Strength and Conditioning Specialist certification. Currently, the Edmonton Reconditioning Program provides services to CFB Edmonton and also provides remote location support services to Yellowknife, Calgary, and Mainland, BC. We have provided our contact information here and encourage you to reach out to us with any specific questions you might have regarding any information or any content presented in this webinar. Okay, so today we are going to discuss various topics surrounding ankle mobility. We're going to begin with theoretical information on the prevalence of musculoskeletal injuries, including those to the ankle within the Canadian Armed Forces. Then we're going to move on into the hierarchy of strength training, where we will discuss different motor control concepts and how they relate to improving overall ankle health. Moving on from there, we will discuss general preparedness and how you can prepare for movement patterns to help you reduce your risk of injury. Finally, Kevin will move through various exercise demonstrations with specific exercises that can be done to improve ankle mobility and health surrounding the ankle joint. We're going to start today by looking at some data regarding the prevalence of musculoskeletal injury in CAF members. In 2016, the CAF released data pertaining to the prevalence of musculoskeletal injuries in CAF members. This data was data that was collected between the years of 2008 and 2013. It showed that musculoskeletal conditions represent the main cause of restricted duties and days off amongst CAF members. If I can turn your attention to the graph at the top of your screen, you can see that musculoskeletal injuries accounted for 32% of restricted duties and days off amongst CAF members. This was in comparison to other such items such as illness, training, and mental health. In addition to this, musculoskeletal injuries represented the number one reason for members not being able to deploy. Further to this, the 2010 and 2014 Surgeon General's reports indicated that musculoskeletal injuries were responsible for between 43 and 66% of all 3B medical releases in the CAF. If you look at the bottom graph on your screen, you can see that sport, PT, and adventure training accounted for the largest percentage of activities associated with the most serious injuries. This is in comparison to other type training activities such as military training, battlefield or battle-related training or battle-related injuries, and military physical training. In addition to this, in 2016, it was reported that injuries to the shoulder, knee, spine, and ankle joints made up 62.1% and 58.2% of all musculoskeletal injuries reported in the CAF in deployment and in garrison activities, respectively. If you look at the image on the right side of your screen, you will see the varying percentages of injuries between in deployment injuries and in garrison injuries. If you look specifically at the spine, you can see that in garrison injuries were 17.6% compared to in deployment, which was 14.4%. This information kind of relates to us in terms of where we see our threat to combat readiness. Based on the data presented, it would appear that the biggest threat to combat readiness is activities that are happening in a training or sports environment, or what we considered a control setting rather than a battlefield setting. In addition to this, we would like to discuss how mobility or flexibility training can lead to or prevent injuries. Previous research has shown that traditional static flexibility programs, for example, where you go and you move into a stretch and hold it for 10 to 15 seconds, can improve joint range of motion and tolerance to stretch, but they do not appear to reduce the risk of injury and in fact may impair muscle performance. In previous exercise settings, you may have witnessed individuals begin their workouts with static stretching. But as we just discussed, this static stretching may not actually be useful in improving performance, and it may be even less useful in reducing the risk of injury. In contrast, what we are going to discuss in depth today is active stability and mobility training, which has been shown to improve balance and neuromuscular control, and which may prevent injuries in joints such as the knee and ankle, and may be useful in the treatment and rehabilitation of low back pain. As we move towards our exercise demonstrations, we want to provide you with some information on key terms related to mobility training and how they relate to movement patterns you will work through. Let's start with capsular health. This can also be known as joint health. The goal in working on capsular health is to have stable, pain-free range of motion around a joint. In this case, we want the ankle joint to be able to move through various ranges of motion without any impingement or discomfort. Ideally, we will have the same capsular health or joint health on both sides of the body. However, based on previous injuries and previous exercise experience, this may not always be the case. Simply put, capsular health is the ability for the joint to move. And then when we focus on fine motor control, we look at the ability to control those ranges of motion. So capsular health is the health of the joint and the ability for it to move free of discomfort or pain. And then when we look at fine motor control, it's the ability to actively control that movement around that joint. And finally, as we move into gross motor control, we look at the ability to achieve power in those specific ranges of motion. As we move forward and we look at ways to reduce the risk of injury, there are 3 factors that we must consider: muscle groups and joint motion, muscle symmetry, which would be, for example, right versus left side of the body, and coordination of movement patterns. So an example of coordination of movement patterns would be your knee tracking during a movement pattern, like a squat. We want your knee tracking properly, not falling in or falling out. At this point, it's very important to distinguish the difference between flexibility, mobility, and stability, as they are sometimes used interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Let's start with flexibility. Flexibility is the absolute range of motion that a joint can move through. Most flexibility exercises are done in a passive sense, and this can be considered your typical stretching where you hold for 15 to 30 seconds and you're in a position, you move into that position, or somebody puts you into that position. Mobility, on the other hand, is the ability to actively move a joint through a range of motion. So this is the ability to have a movable joint and actively move through that joint. So it's not passive, it requires muscle contraction, and it requires coordination to be able to move through the joint. Stability, in contrast to mobility and flexibility, requires you to maintain control of a joint as you move it through a given range of motion. Something interesting to consider that Kelly Starrett has said is that mobility without stability leads to injury. Regardless of how mobile a joint is, if you have an inability to actively control the range of motion, you may not have an effective tool to prevent injury. So stability and mobility become very important in the process of preventing injury. One additional concept that we would like to introduce before we move on to our exercise demos is the concept of hormesis. This concept basically relates to injury prevention and ways in which you can train your body and joints to prevent further injury. If I'm going to prevent an injury, so in this example, we're going to say, I want to prevent the injury of rolling my ankle. I need to expose my body part, so again, in this example, my ankle, to the movement pattern that may result in injury in small controlled doses in order to develop resiliency to that specific injury. These exercises that are contributing to hormesis should be done in a gentle, controlled manner in order to develop joint resiliency over time. It is important to remember that you don't build resiliency through avoidance. Your ankle will not become stronger by avoiding movement patterns that increase the load or the stress on your ankle. In this example, repeated jumps on an unstable surface, or in the picture above, on a triangle type surface, when performed regularly and correctly, strengthen the anatomical structures of the ankle joint and lead to a reduced risk of ankle sprains and dislocations. So these concepts are really important as we move into the exercise demonstrations. Kevin will relate his exercise demonstrations back to the concepts that we've just discussed. And all of these exercises can be done in isolation, they can be done as a group, and they're really important for improving overall ankle health. I'm going to pass it off to Kevin now, who will now walk you through various exercises and demonstrations of those exercises to improve stability and mobility around the ankle joint.
Great. So I just want to say thank you to Aaron for going through the initial portions of this webinar and just kind of touching on some of the foundational things that we're going to be discussing when we get into the exercise demos. Again, my name is Kevin Malahai. I'm the physical exercise specialist in Edmonton with Aaron, and I'm just going to touch on a handful of other components before we get into those exercise demos that are going to really kind of tie into the exercises themselves. The first thing is we're looking at the different types of restrictions that you're going to see. So you can really categorize range of motion issues in the ankle down to two kind of primary categories, and that's myofascial, so soft tissue, or joint restrictions, so the bony surfaces in the joint themselves. When you look at myofascial restrictions, the limitations are around the extensibility of the muscles that surround the ankle joint. So we're thinking predominantly the calf muscles, so the gastrocnemius or the gastroc, and the soleus muscles are likely the culprits of myofascial restriction. The primary things that we're looking at here to be able to reduce the restrictions that you would have on these muscles include active and passive stretching. But when we look at things relate to the deep positions of a squat, where we typically find these restrictions, or landing positions with a bent knee, the soleus flexibility may actually be more valuable to those positions. Other things to consider that may come as a result of reduced dorsiflexion in the ankle are the development of things like plantar fasciitis, tibial stress syndrome, ankle sprains, and then tendinopathy of the Achilles tendon. So those are all going to be things that we consider in the slides to come. So as we move into this next slide, when we're going to talk a little bit more about the joint restrictions aspect, I just want to kind of preface with, we're not going to go super in depth in this. There would be an expectation that you would have a very intimate understanding of the anatomy of the bones and the joint itself that compose the ankle joint. And beyond that, the practicality of really having a deeper conversation about those things isn't necessary for us to take away what we need to understand the mobility component of how these things kind of all tie together. So that being said, again, we're not going to go into super long depth about this, but we're going to discuss it a little bit. So basic things here, when we talk about joint restrictions, we're really talking about the talus bone. So when we're looking at the anatomy of your ankle, the easiest way to explain it is it's the main bony structure that makes up the initial contact between your, or connects to rather, your lower leg bones, your tibia and your fibula. So that's kind of the connective point between your foot and your lower leg. So when we address that, that's what we're looking at. So the limitations of the talus to glide posterior or be able to move back relative to the tibia and fibula in that dorsiflex position. So when we're thinking like the top of our foot up towards our shin bone, those limitations can create a joint restriction. Often as a result of having those joint restrictions, we see the myofascial restrictions come into play as either a guarding or compensatory action. So soft tissue typically compounds or adds to the restriction. And most of these treatments for these types of restrictions are done with manual therapy outside of the professionals within the strength and conditioning world. So we think more like physiotherapy, orthopedic surgeons, chiros, things of that nature. So just a few other anatomical considerations. First being the peroneal muscle that runs on the outside of the lower leg, that plays a significant role in stabilizing our ankle laterally. And when you take into consideration that one of the most common injuries of the ankle is the inversion sprain, or where that foot rolls inward, that becomes a very integral part of making sure that we can do everything in our power to prevent that by strengthening that muscle. The next thing we're going to look at is a tight heel cord. So we're thinking the Achilles tendon area here. We're going to talk about excessive tightness in the slide to come versus optimal, but we're thinking excessive tightness here. So when I have excessive tightness there, it decreases my range of motion to a non-optimal level in dorsiflexion, and as a result, I get compensatory actions which cause my ankle to either twist or bend or move in some way that's not ideal to what I'm wanting. And as a result, I expose myself to being potentially susceptible to acute or chronic injuries. So that's kind of the big takeaway there. And there's also, we can have too much range of motion. We'll talk about that in the next slide as well. So we really got to talk about optimizing that position. The last thing, there was a study done with the U.S. Army Rangers that looked at asymmetry. And so that's why I mentioned this, is it specific to the military population, but also it stresses or brings home an important point in that we need to train unilaterally, because with these individuals, they tested the asymmetry and dorsiflexion in their ankle. So imbalance from one side to the other, and they found that those individuals that had an asymmetry that was greater than or equal to 6.5 degrees, 4 to 5 times more likely to suffer an overusage injury. So very small range of motion when you really look at it, but it had a really significant impact on the health of those individuals. So just something else to consider here. So lower extremity stiffness, and I touched on this in the previous slide. I think I referred to it as tightness. I'm using the terms interchangeably, but lower extremity stiffness. Okay, so this topic is we could talk about this exclusively for the course of a webinar. It's been extensively researched. It's predominantly been researched in the realm of performance when it comes to like running and plyometrics and things of that nature. But when we're talking about this in our webinar specifically, we want to talk about how it plays a role in the prevention of injury, how it plays a role in the integrity of the joint. And so if you think about this like joint stiffness as being kind of a spectrum of excessively tight or too tight, kind of having that middle ground of being what would be more optimal, and then having too pliable on the other end, or not tight enough, if you want to think about it that way, then we're going to look at it from the perspective of what's optimal. So excessively tight would be, let's say I'm stepping off of a box and catching, right? So when I'm excessively tight, I don't have the range of motion I need to be able to dissipate the energy from that fall appropriately. And as a result, I get excessive stressors against the ankle, the knee, whatever tissues are involved in absorbing that energy, because I get it all at once. It's like a car wreck. I hit an immovable object and I just get all that energy at one time. The other end of the spectrum, being too pliable, when I hit, I'm not actually able to create any structure or stability, and I get a bunch of energy leaks all over the place. And basically what that translates to is I get a bunch of weird movement patterns. My knees cave in, my ankles roll out, all kinds of things happen. That's because I don't have enough stiffness. So if you kind of meet in the middle there, I have enough stiffness to dissipate the energy, but enough pliability, or I'm sorry, I have enough pliability to dissipate the energy rather, but enough stiffness to create structure. That's what we're thinking about when we talk about optimal stiffness from a health perspective. So here's the part you guys have all been waiting for. Let's get into the practical application. So we're going to go through the exercise demos. They're broken into 3 components. The first thing we're going to look at is mobility. You have the exercises we're going to go through there on the right. I'm not going to read them all to you because we're going to go through them again anyway. So first is the weight-bearing lunge test. This is done by putting your toes up against the wall, gently bending your knee forward. As you progress, you're going to move your toes away from the wall 1 to 2 centimeters at a time, and you're going to keep doing this until you can no longer get your knee to the wall while maintaining your heel in contact with the floor. Once you've done that, you're going to measure from either your big toe or from your heel to the wall to be able to give yourself a measurement or distance. So the single leg lower, this is basically an eccentric calf raise, keeping my toes in contact with an elevated surface, slight bend of the knee or completely straight in this variation, and I'm just gently leveraging my heel toward the floor until I feel like I hit more or less a stopping point, and I'm just going to sit into that stretch. I want to lower myself over about 3 to 5 seconds. Next, we're looking at the Pales drill in this low lunge position. So what I'm going to do is sit into my low lunge. I'm going to continue to drive the knee forward until I feel like I hit a stopping point where I can no longer keep my heel in contact. Once I get to that end range of motion, I'm going to squeeze or flex the muscles in my leg without actually lifting myself, and I'm going to hang out there for about 5 to 10 seconds. Next, we're looking at this ankle cars drill. Very simply put, I'm going to isolate my ankle down by supporting my upper leg, and I'm going to rotate through the furthest range of motion I possibly can, making a circle, pointing my toes in that direction at all times. At any point that I feel like I want to accelerate through the range of motion, remember, when you want to go fast, go slow, and just control that range of motion as best you can, again, making the biggest possible circle. So in this video, we have Erin doing the low lunge position, this time with a posterior pulling band. So she has that band tied to an immovable surface behind her. Band is placed in the crease of the ankle as she pulls herself into dorsiflexion, and then she's going to sit herself into that low lunge position, doing the exact same progression that she did when she did her Pales drill that we saw a couple movements back without the band. So the only thing that changes here is now we've added that extra bit of tension that's pulling the ankle posterior. So self-massage, this is going to be your better option before training or competition because unlike static stretching, there doesn't seem to be a correlation in decreased power with self-massage. This is done in a cadence of about 1 second per roll. So now we're looking at stability. So we're going to look at exercises that require us to balance in some capacity or do some sort of practical application with this newfound range of motion we got from our mobility drills. The box squat progression. So this is a pretty easy progression to do. You can do it with a chair, a box, a bench, whatever. The idea is that you're sitting to the same spot on the box every time, but with each progression, you're going to move your feet closer. This is going to force your shin angle forward more, which requires more dorsiflexion in the ankle and a more upright torso. So the next progression here is squatting with a dowel or a PVC pipe or whatever you have access to. We've taken away the box so you no longer get to sit to a surface, so you're having to suspend or balance yourself in space, but you still have the added benefit of the stability you get from holding onto the dowel. And by having your hands in a fixed position, it reinforces keeping your chest upright in your squat. For the last 2 squatting progressions, we've moved to a plate squat. Now you're squatting in space, so you don't have the box for support, and you only have 2 points of contact, being both feet. You don't have the dowel to support you. Sitting into your squat, you just extend that plate forward and it serves as a counterbalance. This just helps reinforce balancing you into a good position at the bottom while keeping your chest upright in the bottom of your squat. The next 2 exercises complement each other well. The first is the single leg balance with the heel elevated. The catch here is to try and strengthen the foot itself by keeping your foot completely level, balancing on the ball of your foot, and stabilizing that position in space. The next exercise is our single leg balance on our Bosu ball. The foot is completely supported, but the ankle becomes very unstable. So it's a good complement to one another as they both strengthen the lateral aspects, stability of the ankle itself, and the intrinsic strength of the foot, which plays back into the strengthening the peroneal muscle that we spoke to earlier. So the last set of exercises we're going to look at are your ankle stiffness exercises. Now, If you're coming off pre-existing injury, you've had some sort of restriction to the mobility in your ankle for whatever reason, consult with somebody. These are all very high impact plyometric style drills. So just do your due diligence to be safe here. So my first couple exercises are eccentric jumps, i.e. I'm landing and catching off of low surfaces, so 12 inches or less. The focus of this drill is predominantly landing mechanics, and I want to focus on landing quietly, with good positions and sticking the landing. So I want to make sure that when I hit or contact, I'm freezing in that good position briefly. The next couple exercises are pogo jumps. These are low intensity, fast plyometrics from the ankle with short contact times where my legs are acting like stiff springs. So the next progression is hurdling. We're looking for low hurdles, short contact time with some degree of jump height. We're using that contact time as our reinforcement tool. Just note that I show a lateral variation here. Any of these progressions can be modified to do lateral jumps. So the fourth and final progression, we're looking at depth jumps. We want a short contact time and a maximal height spring at the bottom. So that concludes all the information I have for you guys for this webinar. I hope you enjoyed the information we presented. I have a list of references here if you have any questions about any of the specific things that I brought to you, whether it be the research articles, the text, what have you. If you have any specific questions for Aaron or myself, our contact was up at the first of the webinar, but if you didn't have the opportunity to write that down, you can just contact either of us on our email through the D1. That would be perfectly fine. If you have any other questions that don't necessarily need to be fielded by Aaron or myself, but that relate to this type of training modality, ankle mobility, things of that nature, also reach out to your local PSP staff, fit cords, reconditioning staff, whomever, and they should be able to help you out as well. So thank you guys again for your time, and hopefully we'll talk to you guys again soon.